The trading square of Bjorgvin smelled of damp wood and cattle dung. Beneath its open sky, 3 pairs of warriors in chainmail stepped into a makeshift arena. They were not soldiers, they were slaves, trained to fight to the death, not for glory, but to honor the dead. This was 864 AD, and Jarl Erik Bloodaxe had just buried his father. To mark the occasion, he staged what the skald Snorri later recalled as the first recorded slave combat in Norway. This was not yet a public spectacle. It was a funeral rite, what the Vikings called blot, a sacred duty owed to the deceased. The combatants bled not for sport, but as a solemn offering to Odin. Yet this private ritual, rooted in the Scandinavian custom of human sacrifice at burial mounds, soon took on a different shape. In northern Scandinavia, especially in settlements like Uppsala, these bloody rites had already begun to change. The Danes, former enemies of the Norwegians, had long hosted warrior duels during feasts to the dead. Over time, ritual killing became ritual combat. The death itself became less important than the struggle. It was, as the Christian monk Adam of Bremen later observed, the spilling of blood for the sake and satisfaction of the dead, but one that increasingly entertained the living. By the late 9th century AD, these duels were moving from funerals to festivals. No longer confined to mourning ceremonies, they appeared in the growing roster of Scandinavian games, spectacles sanctioned by kings. Initially religious in nature, these games were held in honor of Thor and Odin, often during times of war. The Thing, fearing divine wrath or seeking divine favor, would vote to fund them, making the games a matter of the entire tribe, not private grief. This transition, from familial ritual to tribal performance, was subtle but irreversible. The involvement of kings grew. Chieftains used these spectacles to gain popularity among the freemen. Blood became politics. Death became display. By the end of the Viking Age, temporary wooden arenas gave way to stone platforms. What began as a somber rite in a muddy trading square had been absorbed into the Scandinavian kingdoms, codified, scheduled, and publicly funded by kings. And so, with each drop of blood spilled on the earth, the tribe itself was writing a new kind of law, one not carved in runes, but in stone. Slaves forced to fight starving beasts. The wooden gate groaned open, and silence fell over the crowd. From the shadows of the pen, a lone figure emerged, barefoot, half-naked, carrying nothing but a short sayax. Across the earth, the cage door rose. Against matted fur, stepped out into the sunlight, starved, alert, and coiled with hunger. This was no duel. It was an execution, staged for public thrill. By the 10th century AD, Scandinavian arenas had become theaters not only of human combat, but of man's forced confrontation with wild beasts. Known as dyrakamp when staged as hunts, or blotblauth when used for executions, these spectacles were designed to blur the line between punishment and entertainment. The condemned, criminals, prisoners of war, and sometimes even rebellious thralls, were thrown into the arena against bears, wolves, or boars, often weakened by hunger to ensure a swift and violent end. The practice had earlier roots. By the late 9th century, kings like Harald Fairhair had realized the political power of spectacle. He famously orchestrated shows in which men were cast against animals in elaborate displays, scenes where blood offered both punishment and applause. The more spectacular the death, the greater the triumph of the ruler. But not all who faced the beast were condemned criminals. Some were trained fighters, Bjornkemper, forced or paid to battle wild animals for the crowd's amusement. Stone carvings and bone plates from the early period depict such scenes with grim detail. A figure with spear raised as a bear lunges, a net hunter dodging the claws of a wolf. One carving from the 10th century shows a fighter eye to eye with a charging beast, caught mid-motion in sculpted terror. These were not fantasies. In Scandinavia, archaeologists unearthed the pelvis of a man, likely a fighter, scarred by deep bite marks matching the jaw of a large bear. The wounds told their own silent tale. He had died locked in combat with a bear. Across the Viking lands, from Trondheim to provincial settlements, this ritual of blood played out again and again. Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the 11th century, recalled how some prisoners would kill themselves before their appointed spectacle rather than suffer a death meant to entertain others. Their refusal was silent rebellion, a final act of control in a world designed to strip them of it. What unfolded in the arena was not mere violence. It was calculated degradation. Hunger was sharpened into a tool. Beasts were starved not only to ensure death, but to amplify suspense, to keep the crowd holding its breath as man faced claw, fang, and fate. In the Viking lands, law and spectacle walked hand in hand, and the roar of a bear was not just nature unleashed. It was the voice of power, fed and starved to serve the tribe. Vattenkamp, the Vikings' deadly water shows. Bleachers. This was not war. It was entertainment. Vikings called them Vattenkamp. Mock naval battles fought not in distant seas, but in carefully engineered basins, often dug by royal order. King Olaf staged the first in 946 AD. Near the fjord, he had an artificial lake excavated to reenact a battle between Norwegian and Danish fleets. Real ships, real weapons, and real men. Condemned prisoners who fought not as actors but as warriors with no hope of survival. The spectacle grew. Harald the Harsh, Olaf's heir, constructed an enormous basin in 1002 AD, measuring 1,800 by 1,200 Scandinavian feet. So vast, it required its own canal to fill it. On those waters, 30 warships clashed, each manned by convicted criminals numbering in the thousands. The scale was staggering. The message was clear. Scandinavia could command not just armies, but nature itself. Sometimes the water shows moved beyond artificial lakes. In the year 1052 AD, King Magnus drained a mountain lake and celebrated with a Vattenkamp. The fighters greeted him with words etched into history. Those who are about to die salute you. Whether those words were scripted or spontaneous, they captured the raw fatalism of men sent to die for public amusement. By the time the great halls opened under Magnus the Good, Vattenkamp had become synonymous with royal grandeur. Some skalds believe he may have used Harald's basin nearby for naval battles during the hall's dedication. Later, under Olaf the Holy, similar games were possibly staged within the halls themselves, their floors temporarily flooded to host miniature maritime carnage. Even under Sigurd the Crusader, a century after Olaf, the tradition endured. He constructed the Vattenkamp Nidaros in 1109 AD, a massive flooded arena near Trondheim, where more battles of spectacle and death played out before roaring crowds. Each Vattenkamp was more than a performance. It was a demonstration of total control. Of water, of men, of lands. In these choreographed wars, Vikings didn't merely reenact conquest.
Elsewhere, a man playing Icarus, the mythical inventor who flew with waxen wings, was ripped apart by another beast. The Skald, with biting irony, wrote, "How you must wish you had your wings now." One of the most disturbing reenactments was the myth of Freya, the goddess cursed to love a boar. Scandinavian crowds witnessed a woman, or possibly a condemned man disguised, thrown to a beast in a twisted imitation of her fate. The performance blurred boundaries between myth, punishment, and voyeurism. Fire, too, played its role. The pitch-soaked garment was fastened to the condemned and set ablaze. Sometimes this was framed as the death of Sigurd, the Scandinavian hero who proved his loyalty by holding his hand in fire. Whether the victim played Sigurd or another fiery martyr, the result was the same. Screams drowned beneath applause. Adam of Bremen, writing as a Christian under Scandinavian rule, bitterly described how victims were burned alive, tied to posts, and mocked as actors in a play of torment. "We are mocked as torchmen," he wrote, recounting executions where men were turned into living torches, pain masquerading as moral spectacle. These mythological tortures weren't about storytelling. They were control, wrapped in ritual. Vikings didn't just kill. They made death an echo of divine punishment, giving the audience not justice, but a perverse form of catharsis. And so, as legends were resurrected in blood and flame, the boundary between theater and execution collapsed. In the Scandinavian arenas, myth was not read, it was relived. Viking arenas turned ritual into policy, spectacle into statecraft. Blood on earth, water and flame forged a culture that measured power by the choreography of death. Their echoes still haunt every debate on violence and entertainment. Which spectacle, funeral duels, bestial hunts, Vattenkamp, or mythic tortures, best exposes Viking control over life itself? Comment below with your insight. As Adam of Bremen wrote in letters to students, "I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more self-indulgent. Yes, even more cruel and inhuman, because I have been among human beings."